So welcome to the Value Added Producer Grant Scholarship webinar, folks. Thanks for signing up and showing up today. My name's Grace, and I'm with Community Alliance with Family Farmers, and I am going to kick us off here. So while I'm kind of taking us through some of the logistical aspects of the webinar, I'd like to invite everyone to please introduce themselves in the chat. You can share your name, where you're calling in from, and the name of your farm or food business that you're here representing. That would be great. Today, our plan is to discuss the USDA's Value Added Producer Grant, and then toward the end of the webinar, we're going to get into CAFF's scholarship program that helps offset the cost of working with a grant writer on your Value Added Producer Grant application. So, Kaylee, if you'll go to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So this first bullet point is actually incorrect. So everyone should have been muted upon entry, but I think I failed to set up the meeting settings. So everyone is actually unmuted upon entry. I think we're going to try to make sure that everyone's muted. But if you're unmuted, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself just so we don't pick up any of your background sound. And then there'll be an opportunity at the end to ask questions, and then you can unmute yourself. Until we get to the question and answer session, which should start right around 5 o'clock Pacific time, you can add questions and comments to the chat. And then we'll wrap things up with a question and answer. And then we are recording this webinar. So a recording and a PDF of the presentation will hopefully be sent to you by tomorrow evening. So we'll go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about Community Alliance with Family Farmers, also known as CAFF. We are a statewide organization that works to support small to mid-scale size family farmers. And we have staff that are located throughout the state, working in a number of different program areas to support farmers. We have our Farmer Services program that provides a range of services from food safety to small farm technology to wildfire support. Our farm to market team helps support farmers with marketing, accessing new markets, ecological farming. That program team helps growers adopt climate smart agriculture practices and conducts research projects on farms throughout the state. Our policy advocacy program helps bring farmer voices to Sacramento and Washington, D.C. And then CAFF also facilitates the California Small Farm Conference, which is coming up at the end of February to early March. So I encourage you all to check out more about the conference. Lots of great workshops in the lineup for this year's conference at CAFF's website. So our presenters today, there are a few folks who I just want to highlight. First, I'll start with myself. My name is Grace again. I am the Farmer Services Program Manager at CAFF. I use she, her pronouns, and I primarily work with growers on food safety. Kaylee Feiereisel is the Farmer Services Director. Kaylee is facilitating the PowerPoint for us today, and then also running the chat box as she can. And then Ellen Rawley is here. Ellen is the founder of Ellen Rawley Creative Strategy Incorporated. And we'll hear from Ellen later in the presentation about her experience as a successful and experienced value-added producer grant writer. I'll pause here and just see if we have any questions so far. Kaylee, I don't know. I know you're doing a lot of things at once. I just want to pause and see if I can answer any questions so far.
No, I think we're good, and got a bunch more people admitted in the last minute or so. So, folks that just joined us, we mentioned this is recorded, and you'll get the video recording and a PDF of the presentation emailed to you in the next day or two.
Great, thanks, Kaylee. So we'll start by just talking about what the Value Added Producer Grant is. For those of you who are newer to the grant or just looking for some more information. So the Value Added Producer Grant provides funding to producers to create or expand value-added enterprises with the goals of expanding market opportunities and increasing producer income. The program is gonna mute some folks. Okay, the program was established in 2000 and has been funded through the Farm Bill since 2002. It's administered through the USDA's Rural Business Cooperative Service and the state, local, or state rural development offices. The program receives permanent mandatory funding each year, but the yearly allocation does fluctuate. And it's a pretty competitive program. Just to give you an idea of what I mean by that, in 2022, so last year, 342 eligible applicants requested more than $54 million, but there was only $32 million of funding available, and that was awarded to the 197 applicants with the highest scores, which means that a little over 55% of applications were awarded. So I'm going to spend the next couple of slides talking about what types of projects are eligible to give you an idea of maybe where your value-added product idea or project aligns with the eligibility requirements of this grant. So there's the commodity processing projects, which increase value by changing the commodity's physical state. So some of these can be kind of obscure and not totally clear. So we have some examples. So an example of a commodity processing project would be that a farm processes cosmetically damaged sweet potatoes into dehydrated sweet potato dog treats and sells those direct to consumer through farmers markets and their CSA program. Commodity segregation projects increase value by keeping the commodity physically separated in production and distribution. So an example of a commodity segregation project would be a farmer cooperative that sells their non-GMO feed into new markets. Then moving on to the next category, market differentiation. These types of projects increase value by marketing the commodity's special identity or character. And so it could be a farm that packages organically grown fresh herbs into branded and specially designed clamshells. Local food projects increase value by marketing food for local markets. So a rancher pays for a professional study to determine the feasibility of expanding their processing of pork into bacon, sausage, ham, and market them through a CSA program. And then finally, the last two, there's on-farm renewable energy project, which realize value by transforming natural resources into energy on the farmstead. So an example of this would be a dairy that sells carbon credits on the California Carbon Credit Exchange as a result of methane gas production from their dairy biodigester. And then there's also mid-tier value chain projects, which increase value by linking farmers with local regional supply networks in which they are equal partners. And so this could be a farmer-led food hub that processes quick frozen vegetable blends and sells them to institutional markets. So obviously these examples can change depending on what type of project you have, but hopefully that overview gives you a good idea of what types of projects are eligible based on those 6 categories that include on-farm renewable energy and mid-tier value chain. So now we'll get into more of the eligibility requirements. Overall, this grant is really geared toward helping farmers, and we can see that through the types of entities that are eligible for the grant. The independent producer entity is eligible, and those are farmers, ranchers, and harvesters, such as loggers and fishers. And these folks must be directly engaged in the day-to-day labor, management, and field operations of the agricultural commodity that's being grown for the value-added product. So agricultural harvesters, people who contract out field production, or investors or wealthy people who own a farm but have other people run it for them are not considered independent producers. Farmer or rancher cooperatives are also eligible to apply for the value-added producer grant. And so this is a business owned and controlled by independent producers that is incorporated or otherwise identified as a cooperatively owned business. There are also agricultural producer groups. And so these are defined as a nonprofit membership organization that represents independent producers and operates with a mission that includes working on behalf of independent producers. There are some requirements for the entities that apply as agricultural producer groups. The majority of the applicants' membership must meet the definition of an independent producer. And the majority of the applicant's board of directors must also meet the definition of an independent producer. Next, there are majority controlled producer-based businesses, and these are entities in which the majority of the financial and voting interest belongs to independent producers. So an example that some folks might be familiar with would be a farmer-led food hub. Moving to the next slide, for groups who are not yet incorporated, so folks from the basically the groups that I just mentioned outside of independent producers, for those who are not incorporated, you can apply as a steering committee, which has a very specific definition from USDA that's quite long. So I'm not going to define it here, but essentially 100% of the group must be independent producers. And then federally recognized tribes and tribal entities must demonstrate that they meet the definition requirements for one of the 4 eligible applicant types in order to be eligible to apply for the value-added producer grant. And if folks have more questions about eligibility requirements for Native nations, rural development state offices and application materials can provide more information than I just did about eligibility requirements specifically. So there are currently 2 types of grants available through the VAPG. There are planning grants and there are working capital grants. So we'll get into the details of both of those on the next couple of slides. So planning grants can be used to fund economic planning activities such as the development of business and marketing plans and feasibility studies that are needed to determine the viability of value-added products. The maximum award for planning grants is $75,000 and the project length cannot exceed 3 years. So there are some tips here for folks who are interested in applying for planning grants. The USDA rural development representatives who are scoring these applications, even though the max award is $75,000, they expect awards to be more in the $15,000 to $25,000 range. And those reps also don't really like to see planning grant applications that are greater than 1 year. With both planning grants and working capital grants, there are eligible expenses. So you're only eligible to get reimbursement for expenses that are eligible. And so some examples of eligible expenses for planning grants are to conduct feasibility studies, to develop business plans for processing and marketing your value-added product. You could pay a qualified consultant to conduct or develop a feasibility study, business plan, and or marketing plan. And it could also be used for recipe development. Planning grant funds may not be used to compensate applicants or family members for their participation in feasibility studies. So that's it for the details about planning grants. Working capital grants, on the other hand, can be used to fund the operation of a value-added business venture, specifically to pay for eligible project expenses related to processing, sales, distribution, and/or marketing of your value-added products. The maximum award for working capital grants is $250,000, but grants of $50,000 or more must include a feasibility study, business, and/or marketing plan. It depends on what type of application you're submitting for which specific type of plan is required. So we'll get into kind of how to figure that out in a couple of slides. The project length for working capital grants is no more than 3 years. And there are 3 types of working capital applications that applicants can select from. So there's a simplified application, an emerging market application, and a market expansion application. And we have a flow chart that's linked on this slide, and then hopefully that can be popped in the chat that can help folks determine which application best applies to your operation. And hopefully that can help you figure out what the specific application requirements are for that type of working capital application. And then just as a reminder, we will be sending this recording around, and then we'll send a PDF of this presentation. So any of the embedded links that are in here, you'll be able to access those after the presentation. There are some additional eligibility requirements to apply for either a planning or working capital grant. So applicants are only eligible to apply for one of these each grant cycle. So you can only apply for a working capital grant or a planning grant. You can't apply for both. And then applicants can only have one active grant at a time. And then there are also eligible and ineligible expenses for working capital grants. The working capital grant eligible expenses, we've kind of categorized based on these buckets. So there's some examples on this slide. There are administrative expenses that can be covered, such as designing or purchasing a financial accounting system. Processing and production costs can be covered. Some of them that would include a food safety certification related directly to the processing of a value-added product. Distribution costs can be covered, so shipping fees that you might use for e-commerce. Marketing and promotions costs, like signage that advertises your product at a farmer's market. General operating expenses can be eligible, such as routine maintenance to keep the equipment in working condition, and equipment or supplies with a value of less than $5,000. So think of, a smaller scale dehydrator rather than something larger with a value of over $5,000. Utility costs can be covered. This would include utility charges to run a processing facility. And then some staff expenses can be covered. So this would be paying salaries of employees without ownership or immediate family interest to process, market, and/or deliver the value-added product. And then we have some examples of ineligible expenses for working capital grants. So grant funds cannot be used to pay for agricultural production, harvesting, or commodity transportation. They cannot be used for repair, acquisition, or construction of a building or facility. They cannot be used to purchase, rent, or install equipment with a value of over $5,000. Unfortunately, they can no longer be used for packaging and label design. They cannot be used to create branded merchandise that's either resale or to give away. And then they cannot be used to fund certifications related to the production of agricultural commodities. So organic, GMO-free certifications like that. And then in the next couple of slides, we have some more like administrative type requirements for the grant. So the grant has a matching funds requirement, which means that the applicant has to put in $1 either through cash or in kind for every dollar of funding that they receive from the USDA. 50% of the match that the farmer contributes can be the value of your time working on the project, and other in-kind contributions. There's a range of what in-kind contributions can be, but they include the value of the raw commodity that's used and third-party in-kind contributions. And then matching funds that are either cash or in kind must be secured when your application is submitted. So it's part of the application requirements. And then a tip here for anyone applying for the value added producer grant would be that in previous years, having some cash match contribution increase the likelihood of an applicant receiving funds. So USDA likes to see that applicants have some cash match contribution. And so to help illustrate the matching funds requirement, we have an example here. So say that a farmer submits an application for a working capital grant to expand production of their preserved tomatoes and enter into new markets. The farmer is applying for $49,000. And so as part of their grant application, they also need to indicate where $49,000 of matching funds will come from. So in this example, the farmer will contribute $24,500 of their own time as an in-kind contribution. And you might be wondering where we got how we determined the dollar amount of this farmer's time. And so that amount is calculated using the hourly rates for agricultural labor, which are released by the USDA's Economic Research Service. So the number of hours can change depending on what that hourly rate is. And those rates, I'm not sure actually if they're released every year, but they might be released every few years. And so you would want to base those off of the most recent numbers. For this example, we used the data from 2020 and could probably get away with using it for another year or until that data is updated. And then you'd also want to use the hourly rate that relates specifically to the type of position that the farmer is in. And so you would want to use the hourly rate for a supervisor or someone in a managerial position, not someone who's working, for example, as a field laborer. And then in this example, the farmer would provide the remaining $24,500 in cash. Okay, and then there are yet some additional requirements. So these are some additional requirements that would affect project eligibility. So overall, applicants must demonstrate that their project adds value to the commodity, will expand their customer base, and increase revenues. So as you're thinking about approaching your application, these three requirements could be something to focus on highlighting. And then the producer applying for the grant must grow at least 51% of the raw commodity needed for the project on their own farm. Applicants who already received a planning grant for the proposed project cannot receive another planning grant for the same project. But applicants who already received a working capital grant for the proposed project can also not receive additional grant funds for that exact project. However, a farm can apply for the same commodity and product again, but the project focus has to be different. So an example here would be if a farmer for their first application were selling dog treats at a farmer's market, the second time they could apply for funding to sell their dog treats through wholesale to pet stores. And then if an applicant has an active grant at the time of a new application, the current grant must be closed out within 90 days of the application deadline to be eligible for the new round of funding. Okay, I am going to turn it over to Ellen Rawley to introduce herself and tell us more about the process through that she takes farmers through to apply for the value added producer grant.
Thank you so much, Grace. I love that you go through all the details and then I get to just talk about fun examples and phases of writing the grant. That was super thorough. So hi, everyone. I'm Ellen Rawley, owner of Ellen Rawley Creative Strategy. And I started writing for this grant in 2016 and have written 3 to 7 grants a year since then. I'm based here in Petaluma, California, and we're having a beautiful day of no rain, which is so wonderful. I help farms launch and grow profitable product lines. I really focus on value-added farmers and whether that's turning crops into a product to sell or selling in some way that's going to get you a higher return in the marketplace. Through writing this grant, I've secured over $1 million in grant funding through the value-added product producer grant for small farms in 7 states, which really is the joy of my job, is seeing how funding can help farms get to the next level in terms of their product and get the support they need to really make it something that's sustainable. Many of you I noticed in the chat, people were kind of talking about which products they make. And for anyone that came in since then, if you want to put that there, it helps me think through who I'm talking to and what examples to use. But you all know, it's almost like running a second business when you're a grower and now you're also producing a value-added product. So having some sort of funding to support that part of your work I've seen be really impactful for my clients. And then that last bit, I've created products with clients that have been featured in all sorts of fancy places. But the real joy, like I said, is seeing funding get to the farms that need it. We can advance the slide. So to give you a sense of farms I've worked with, this grant is one thing I really love about this grant is it's not only for the big farms. You heard Grace talk about it really has to be whatever type of farm you fall into. It has to be a farm that is being run. The applicant has to be someone who's actually hands-on part of the decision-making and the operations of the farm. So it really can be for small, medium size, and yes, larger farms. So clients that I've worked with, they've had less than $10,000 in sales to over $1 million. Year 2 of farming to multi-generational family farms, selling through farmers markets, farm stands, CSAs, local stores, grocery, and as an ingredient to food service, processing on farm, working with co-packers, from selling crushed tomatoes to apple cider caramels, to dried rose petals, to grass-fed hot dogs, to organic coleslaw mix, to organic grapefruits. It really can be used in a wide variety of operations. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a few examples so you can start thinking and identifying if this is a good grant for you. And also in this, I want to call out why, as a grant writer, I felt like this farm was ready for this grant program. That's important because it is not a small undertaking to write this grant. I'm not going to lie and say that it's easy. It's not. So in some cases, it might be that you're ready this year to apply for the grant. And in some cases, it might be that with a year's time, you'd get yourself to a place that you're going to be ready to apply. So with each of these examples, I'm going to kind of give you a sense of why I felt this farm who did get funded was ready to write this grant. So that's just a preamble. The first one is Little Apple Treats. They're here in Sebastopol, California. They have an organic heirloom orchard that they just kind of happened to move on when they had a nursery business, and they started turning those apples that were coming out of the orchard into apple cider, and then started making these amazing caramels where they boil down the juice and use that to make these caramels. So when they came to me, that this is what their packaging looked like. They were in farmers markets and they were selling really well there. They had a good base of support, and they had gotten into a few really local stores to start selling wholesale. But in the stores, the caramels weren't really moving as well as at the farmers market. And when I looked at their packaging, I could see this is a great package for farmers market, where really a lot of the job of selling the product is on you. You're giving each person a spiel, you're giving people samples, you're talking about the product, and then someone purchases it. However, on a grocery store shelf, this package doesn't really give you too much information about the product itself. It also, those are 3 different types of caramels, where with it, to the naked eye on a shelf, you wouldn't necessarily differentiate that those are 3 different flavors of caramel. So buyers were only buying one in instead of buying a few different of their flavors to display on the shelf. Also, they were using this packaging because they could construct the bases. They'd come flat, you constructed the bases, and then you slipped on these tops. That allowed them to buy in bulk on the base to bring down their cost. And now they're just slipping on these different, the different outer tops. It's a great way to be able to get packaging when you don't have a big budget. But what ends up happening is now all your cost is coming in on the labor, because they're sitting there having to construct each base by hand. So at the end of the day, while it was saving them because they could buy, the cost of the packaging was low, it was actually overall costing them more money. And their cost of goods was such that they were losing money on some sales of some products into wholesale. So they wanted to go more into grocery. They wanted to be able to do that, but they needed a solution for their packaging so that they could actually scale and create more. And they also needed a solution that was going to help customers understand who they were and entice buyers to bring more than one flavor into their store. Next slide. So through the value-added producer grant, one of the main focuses of this first grant of theirs was to change the packaging that they were using. So this package now, each flavor had its own complete design and own complete color. You can see one example is in here, and then there's this other example in the Martha Stewart advertisement. What this did was entice buyers to buy more than one, because now it looks beautiful on the shelf. It ended up being much more giftable. And while this type of packaging was always a no-brainer, before the value-added producer grant, they didn't have the money to invest in a large enough run of each flavor of packaging. Many of you probably know packaging has minimums. And so their old way of doing it, they were able to meet those minimums with those bases. Well, now if they're going to have to meet a 3,000 box minimum on 5 different boxes, that's a lot of money for that first sale, that first purchase of packaging. And where is that money going to come from? It came from the value-added producer grant. So in this case, it was packaging purchases, it was other ingredient costs. So it's their apple cider, but they have the rose petals, the toasted almonds, those things that they were purchasing, sell sheet design, and professional photography. So with this, Joanne, once the thing she said about her grant, she said, the USDA value-added packaging grant that Ellen got for us was critical in improving our branding, leading to a huge jump in sales and the ability to be picked up by larger accounts such as Italy, Oliver's, and Buy Right Markets. Before you move slides, I'll just say, so that second piece, in terms of why were they ready for the value-added producer grant? So a few things. They had the infrastructure. They had a kitchen that they could make the product in, and they had been making the product in. They had their processed food registration, which is what's required in California to make the product. They had some sales that I could use to project sales throughout the grant period, and that's part of the grant application, is projecting sales. They did not have their cost. When I asked them, like, what is your cost of goods? They didn't have an answer for me, but they had the ability to pull out those numbers. So I worked with them on that, but they were able to then say, okay, how many can we make in a day of production? Those kind of numbers they were able to pull together when I needed them. Let's see. And they were growing 51%, over 51% of the apples that went into the product. They were growing 100%. So they were eligible in that way. So those are the kinds of things. We also had some relationships with buyers that we could get letters of support from. So those are the kind of things that made me realize this is a project that's ready, that's going to score well enough to actually get funding. Next slide. So another example is Oya Organic Farm. They're down in Hollister, California. And when they came to me, they were making a few products through a cottage food permit on their farm and using them at their farmers market and in their CSA. And they wanted to grow this part of what they did because, like many people, probably anyone who has a CSA can relate to, they were having this issue of they would have great CSA membership in the spring and the summer, and then in the winter, as their variety dropped in the field, so did their CSA membership. And then in the spring, it was a lot of effort to try to get people back in, and each year the retention was down, so they had to find new people to fill in the spots and keep growing their CSA. So it felt like their CSA was doing good, but it felt like it was like stuck in this kind of feedback loop of losing people and then trying to get people back in and just plateauing in a way. And so they wanted to be able to use their seconds from the field to make products that they could put in their winter CSA to keep their membership happy and engaged and subscribed through the winter. Do I have a second slide on this? Yeah. So what we did with them, there were design fees for their website, putting together their website, for example, having this mailer that went out that was about the CSA, also doing things for Instagram and Facebook and creating campaigns there. It created their own CSA portal build out on their website so they could manage their CSA. And there was a salary for a CSA manager. Other things were co-packer fees. So that was another one. They now could ship their tomatoes instead of really, they didn't have on hand the people and the time to be making these products themselves. We actually saw that if they moved it to a co-packer, they could actually reduce their cost of making the product. And the grant was able to cover the cost of the co-packer. Marcia said, before working with Ellen to secure a value-added producer grant from the USDA, we had tomatoes rotting in the field. Every season, I would think about preserving them, but I didn't have the time to take on the work myself. Now that we have the grant, I'm making our value-added product line a reality and something we are proud of. So the reason I thought that Marcia was ready when she came to me with this idea to write a value-added producer grant, one, there was a co-packer in her area that would be able to do the work. Again, these are things that sometimes in the beginning phases, we can identify together, but you need to write for, this is for working capital, as you've noticed, neither of these was a planning grant, but for working capital, you need to have the ability to make the product. Like if you don't have a co-packer, if you have an idea, but you don't have a co-packer and you don't have the certifications that you can make it on farm, and there's not really one that you know of in your area, most likely that's going to mean take this year to figure that stuff out and apply for a value-added producer grant next year, because they're going to ask in the feasibility section for you to lay out your plan to be able to do the work of the project. And they want to see that if they give you the money, you have the project ready to go, that it's not something like they could release the funding and then you don't find a co-packer and it turns out there's not one that works in your area and it takes 2 years for you to get your processed food registration. They're not interested in funding people who can't really use the money that they're handing out. Other things, she simplified. So this is a great example of Marsha and Oya Organic Farm. They are a diversified veggie farm. So they are not just, the products I showed are tomato based. They're not just growing tomatoes. Tomatoes is one of many things they grow. They run a CSA, they grow everything. But in the application itself, she had the focus to say, we're going to take our tomatoes and we're going to make tomato products from them. And we're going to use that to grow our CSA. And obviously any work that we're doing, all that marketing work you saw, is going to grow her CSA overall and therefore create a home for her strawberries and her kale and her broccoli. But the grant application itself would be muddled by trying to include all of those different crops. And she was willing and had the willingness to say, right now, I'm going to focus my efforts on really this crop and this product line. And that's really important. I know how much it's exciting to do all the things on the farm, but for you to like score well on these applications, you have to focus.
Thanks so much, Ellen. Those 2 examples were a great way to take what was covered at the beginning about the eligibility requirements and the eligible costs and expenses, and really ground it in what's actually going on with the clients that you work with. So I'm going to take us through a couple of slides about next steps, and then we'll hear from Ellen in just a minute too, and then we'll get into Q&A. So let's see. So the 2023 Value Added Producer Grant typically opens early in the calendar year. So that's between the end of December and the end of February. So obviously we're almost into the middle of January. So we expect the grant could be released anytime, between in the next week to the end of February. But we won't know for sure until the USDA opens the grant application process. Typically, applicants have 60 to 90 days to write and submit their applications, which is a pretty short window, and every day counts. So as you're going through and looking at the application materials, definitely pay attention to the deadline. As I mentioned, as of today, the grant has not opened. And maybe the reason why a lot of folks are here is to learn about CAFF's Value Added Producer Grant Scholarship Program. So this year is our 2nd year running the scholarship program, and we have up to 6 scholarship spots for farmers interested in working with Ellen on their VAPG application. And there's a disclaimer at the bottom of the slide. Only farmers that are based in California are eligible for this scholarship. So that's definitely an important eligibility component for the scholarship program. And I'm going to hand it back to Ellen, who's going to describe the process of what it looks like for farmers to work with her on an application. And then we'll get into more of the details about what the scholarship application process looks like.
Thanks, Grace. So I attack these applications through this 5-phase process that I've developed over time to just bring a little sanity and ease to the process of applying for this grant. So this process is what I use in my one-on-one work, and then also in my mentorship, which is a more guided DIY approach to writing your application. So there's 5 phases. First, we plan. So we give you 1 week to transfer all the needed documents and resources. This is things like your P&L and to get together things around your cost of goods and other stuff that we request. And then we build a recommended strategy for growth with those numbers, including projected cost of goods, production quantities, sales projections, all the things that the grant is going to ask for. Then we move into collect. We deliver templates with our one-on-one process. We deliver letters of commitment that are basically mainly written out for the folks that we've brainstormed with you would be good to gather those letters from. And we also gather market research because the grant requires third-party research. The client is responsible for sending those letters off to relevant parties and returning them signed to us. And also collecting, this must have gotten, we forgot one, collecting different forms, depending on if you're getting third party in kind, there's just forms that you have to get people to sign. And we put that on you because it's your relationships. Together, we brainstorm budget items and collect quotes for those budget items. So we know how to budget out different things. Then we move into budgeting. We take all those quotes that we collected during collect, and we build a balanced budget based on our brainstorming for you. You have 3 to 5 days to review that budget, ask questions, request changes, and then we finalize that budget and we submit it to USDA for a pre-review. After that, the only changes to the budget are things that the USDA suggests. In terms of our relationship, the budget is finalized. Next slide, please. Then we move into writing, which is the biggest part of this process, is doing the writing last so that you don't have to do a ton of changes to the application. So we write a complete draft of the application for our one-on-one service, and then the client is expected to read it and give feedback. The timeline is usually 3 to 7 days for that, depending on the application window. So just know this process moves fast. So you do have to have, we say, about 3 to 5 hours a week to work on the items that we're giving you to do. And we only give you short windows in which to do them. Then we submit. So Ellen Rawley Creative Strategy, that's ERCS. We incorporate the edits to your final application. We fill out all the required forms. We deliver electronic folders containing the full application, as well as a checklist to help you print and submit the application. And then you're expected to do the final read through, check all of the application materials, print them out, assemble them, and bring them to the post office to mail them by the deadline. But of course, we're there, me and my assistant Liz, to help address any questions along the way.
Great, thanks, Ellen. All right, so more about CAFF scholarship program. So the program has opened as of 4:51 p.m. today. We'll provide a link to the application for the scholarship program in the next couple of slides. The program provides partial funding to work with Ellen to construct a fundable application for up to $49,998 worth of government funding. An important note about this is that the price, or let me get to the pricing actually. So the scholarship provides $4,500 for applicants toward the cost of working with Ellen, and then the applicant must come up with the remaining $2,500 of their own funding to meet the total cost of working with Ellen and Liz, which is $7,000. So Ellen and CAFF will work together to make sure the $4,500 goes to Ellen, and then the scholarship awardee must pay the $2,500 up front, so at the start of working with Ellen. And then the pricing shown here is for applications only, so not a business plan or a feasibility study that's required for larger applications, which is why this the total amount that you could apply for from the government is less than that $50,000 threshold. So Growers can apply for the scholarship by submitting an online application that describes their value added product venture. And then after the scoring committee scores all of the applications, we're asking applicants to be available for a short phone interview to discuss their application in case more information is needed. And then scholarship recipients will be selected based on a set of criteria and then notified of their award. So we have some tips for submitting a scholarship application. Reviewers are going to assess the competitiveness of your project based on how well the project will score on the VAPG scoring system. So some of those elements about why Little Apple Treats and Oyo Organics made strong candidates for the Value Added Producer Grant are also components that the scoring committee will be looking at for the scholarship application. So based on our experience with this scholarship application in the past, higher scoring applications have clear and detailed project descriptions. They are projects that focus on 1 to 2 commodities and 1 to 3 value-added products. So really focusing in similar to how Ellen described the Oyo Organic project. Previous sales of value-added products or a similar product make a stronger scoring application. And then those folks who can provide financial documentation, whether that's a cost of goods sold, sales projections, profit and loss. And then folks who have strong project partners who will write letters of commitment to be submitted with their application. And then we have a do and a don't list for folks that kind of gets into more detail. So please do be specific with your product description in your application. Describe your history with producing value-added products if you have any. Explain how your value-added product contributes or will contribute to your business goals. Again, narrow down to 1 to 3 products. Describe any existing infrastructure or food safety licenses that you have that could aid in the development of your value-added product and application. Please check your plans against the eligible expenses that are associated with this grant. Because there is a clear list of or a clear line of ineligible and eligible expenses. Make sure that your project isn't totally relying on ineligible expenses. And then include any links to products that you have or have produced in the past for the scoring committee to get an idea of your experience. And then we have a list of don'ts. So as I said, don't provide a project with ineligible expenses or that relies heavily on ineligible expenses. We're really looking for a description of value-added products, either the ones that you've produced in the past, currently producing, the ones that you want to produce through this grant, instead of just having a list of them. Don't just describe the product you are making without mentioning the necessary local, state, and federal registrations that you need to produce those products. Don't be vague, and please don't wait until the last minute to submit the application. There are three different segments of the application, and the middle segment is the one that asks for the most description. So please try to allow for time to complete that. And then we tried our best to provide a scholarship timeline. A lot of this is dependent on when the USDA releases applications or releases their call for applications. And so we've kind of developed an estimate of like how many days it will take for different things to fall into motion once that happens. So today we have opened the scholarship application. Day 1 of this process of being awarded that scholarship application and working with Ellen really starts when the USDA opens the Value Added Producer Grant for applications. So once that happens, A week after that is when the scholarship application will close, which means as of now, we don't know when the scholarship application will close. A couple of days after the scholarship application closes, within those couple of days is when the scoring committee will score and come up with like the top applicants, and then contact the applicants for a phone interview. A few days after that is when scholarship awardees will be notified. And then as you can see, a couple days after that, on day 14 of the process, awardees would be onboarded with Ellen, which includes submitting their $2,500 payment. And then only a couple of days after being onboarded is when awardees would start to work with Ellen and ask to deliver relevant sales and costing information needed to begin the planning phase. So hopefully that timeline gives you an idea of how quickly things fall into place once the USDA opens the value added producer grant for applications. And our goal is really to get you started working with Ellen and Liz as quickly as possible, because 60 to 90 days is not a very long time to produce an application. It's enough time when you're working with Ellen and Liz, but still you'll be taking up all of that time. So if you have more questions about the scholarship, we're going to host office hours in a couple of weeks on January 25th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. via Zoom. And this will be an open space where you can ask questions about our VAPG scholarship. So encourage folks to put that in your calendar. I'll also send it in an email to everyone tomorrow. And then we have a few additional resources just to point to before we get into the question and answer session. Earlier this fall, we hosted, CAFF in collaboration with Ellen, hosted a 3-part value added product webinar series. And you can find all of the recordings of those webinars on our YouTube channel. Some of the information that we covered in that webinar series was covered in this webinar as well, but it definitely goes into more detail. And then Ellen, I don't know if you want to come off mute, if you're in a good place to do that, just to talk briefly about your grant writing mentorship that's available.
Sure. Another resource is the grant writing mentorship. So this mentorship I've been running for 2 years. It's a guided DIY approach. So I do say you should expect to spend about 10 hours a week on writing the grant, but I lead you through the process through group calls, templates. We have a whole guidebook that leads you through how to write the grant yourself. And it also includes an individual review of your draft application by me personally. It starts at $900. So for anyone who the $2,500 for the scholarship is beyond their budget, or if you're just excited to do this yourself, everyone who's written an application through the mentorship has gotten funded. So I am pretty excited to offer that way of approaching the application as well. And you can find more information on my website, ellenrawley.com, or there's a link, I think, when you get the presentation. And this is William.
William's a cutie. Okay, so we have one more scholarship opportunity for folks to consider as well. So CAFF is offering scholarships for up to 10 farmers to attend the Acidified Foods Manufacturing School at no cost. So this is an online program that's offered through North Carolina State. It's an online course, virtual, it's self-paced, but there are quizzes that are associated with the material. So this is for farmers who make acidified value-added products like salsa, acidified peppers, fresh packed pickles are some examples. And then after completing the course, students would receive a certificate to demonstrate that they meet the training requirement of the FDA acidified regulation. So we also have a link to that application, which is accepting applicants on a rolling basis until we award all 10 of those scholarships. And then before we launch into question and answer, I have a poll here with just a few questions, and would love to get folks' feedback about how this webinar went, and then also where you're coming from. So if you'll take a few moments to complete the poll, and then once we have mass participation, I'll move us on to question and answer.
How do you access the poll?
It should pop up on your screen. And if it's not, I don't know how to make it. Maybe, I don't know if it works if you're on a phone or a device.
So it could be a phone thing.
Yeah, I'm on a phone.
Okay.
Yeah.
That doesn't usually work.
That's good to know. Oh, it looks like it worked for Kimberly on their phone.
What
Maybe
if
it's a
there's
certain type
no
of phone.
answer for number 3 that is right for me, because I'm still not sure if we're eligible. So I'm interested in learning more, but that there's no option under number 3 for that kind of situation.
Well, I wonder if maybe you could select like, yes, I want to, but need time to prepare. Maybe part of figuring out the eligibility would be preparing.
I guess that would be the very first part of preparing. Thank you.
I think we could add an option in the future though. So yeah, I think working within the parameters that we have, I think that's your best option. And next year we can add another one. So thanks for letting us know about that. Okay, so it looks like some folks, I appreciate you all.
I found it. If you go to your bottom right and like glide the options all the way to the right, there's a more button, and then polls and quizzes. That if that helps, hopefully.
Thanks for letting us know. I'll give it a couple more moments for folks who maybe just found that on their phones. And then I encourage folks to keep dropping questions into the chat. I have a list that I'm taking, so I'm kind of taking stack based on who asked, and then I think which ones haven't been answered. Ellen, a lot of them need to be asked to you based on all of your experience. So let's see, I think, yeah.
I'm happy to, I know that we're at 5:05, but I'm happy to stay if you guys are fine with extending the Q&A.
Yeah, well, we have until 5:30.
Oh, we have until 5:30. Yes, we do. Okay, good. I was like, did I talk for a really long time? Okay, perfect. Yes.
Yeah, we have until 5:30. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. Thanks everyone so much for participating in that. Okay, so Ellen, the first question that we got, I think that hasn't been answered, is from Colby in the chat. And Colby says, how challenging is it to receive a grant if I have a startup nonprofit farm?
So it doesn't matter if it's like a nonprofit or a for-profit, that part, this is what I'll say. Okay. The parts that could get tricky with that are, one thing that the grant reviewers do look at, they've told me just in conversation, is they do look at your P&L and see how the farm is, how the operation is doing, for them to then gauge if they think it's basically almost like submitting, you know, a business plan to a bank for them to fund a business loan or something. So they'll look at those kind of financial statements to see if they feel like the project has a good chance of working out. In a nonprofit environment, depending on how you structure that, if the farm really isn't sustainable in itself, and there's big losses, and a lot of it is being held up by the donations part of being a nonprofit, then that could get tricky in terms of like making the case that the project is going to be successful and sustainable post-grant period. Because in the feasibility section, you have to say post-grant period, how are we going to be able to keep the growth that we achieved during the grant period? The projects always have to involve growth. You have to be increasing your customer base and increasing your revenue. And then you have to show that you're going to be able to sustain that. So that's the one thing that when I hear nonprofit, that it could possibly be that, you know, it's not an issue. It's just something to think about, and that we'd want to strategize how we'd present it to make sure that we address those questions that might come up in their mind. The startup part of it, I've really seen people with very little sales for the product line get a simplified application grant. I think if you were so the simplified application goes up to $50,000. If you only had like $5,000 worth of sales, I would not suggest doing a $249,000 ask for a grant, just because, again, they're going to look at, is it really reasonable for us to expect this business that's only selling $5,000 worth of stuff right now to be able to take on the growth required to make sense that we put $249,000 into this project? So if you're at a really startup phase and you want a working capital grant, I'd say my advice would be to focus on a simplified application and get through that simplified application, which is the less than $50,000, you could get yourself to a phase of growth that then in a few years you could apply for a larger grant the second time around when you have a slightly different project than the first time. So that would kind of be, I definitely think people who are new shouldn't be scared away from this grant. I think they do seem to want to fund people who are still small, but you would want to be realistic about how much money you're asking for.
Thanks, Ellen.
Mm-hmm.
The next question that we have is from Ash. Ash asks, is it right that packaging design costs are not covered by the VAPG grant anymore?
So the working capital grant is, I think, what you're referring to, Ash, because with the planning grant, there's maybe like branding work or things like that you could put in there. That would be what I call design. With the working capital grant, they don't want to see the word design. Anytime I do a pre-submission of a budget and it says design, they say that's not eligible. However, if you already have brand assets and you're working with a professional to like format those or lay them out in some way, but you have the idea of what you want them to be already, then that is something that I have gotten covered, because to get the thing printed, it needs to be in a printable file. So it's not design, it's more layout and formatting.
Thanks, Ellen.
Hmm.
Ariana asks, how about installing a wash station for vegetables? I don't know if we've ever had this question asked. Would that be something that would be eligible if it's under that $5,000 threshold for a working capital grant that could be funded?
If it's under the $5,000, then yes, I don't know how much those cost. And then because it's vegetable, if the vegetables are being sold as vegetables, then you'd either fall under the local food, which the local category is only for food, or if you're selling those vegetables as like organic or something else, then it would fall within that category. And then you could pay for the washing if it was less than $5,000.
Okay.
It's interesting, the equipment thing, because some things that we would think of as equipment, sometimes the grant reviewers consider supplies, and supplies doesn't have it was in the it's an interesting thing because I haven't seen that the supplies is less than $5,000. It's equipment, but those categories are not necessarily intuitive. So some of those questions, if it's like a really specific question about a specific piece of equipment and if that would be eligible, I always say the best person to ask is your state rep, which you can get to if you just put in your browser USDA RD state rep, someone will come up, and all the ones that I've worked with have been super, they do respond to emails, because that's going to be the final answer on some of those really specific questions about a purchase and if it's eligible. Oh, but one other thing I wanted to say about that is just one thing to think about, because folks have come to me that one of the things that they were hoping to get covered by this grant, I have to break the news to them, this is not something that can get covered by this grant. Kind of a second layer of thinking that you can explore, if that's true for you, is what things am I covering now that if I got covered, I would have the funds to pay for that thing. So in that case, for example, if you're right now paying the people who are doing the washing and paying a delivery driver to deliver the produce to the final customer and pay like those expenses, if you could get those covered by the grant, now do you have the money to pay for the washing machine yourself?
Great, thanks, Ellen.
Mm-hmm.
Rob has a question. And we have a lot of questions coming through, I think, at the end as I get through. So I'm going to try to make sure that we can get through all of them.
I'll try to be quicker too. I know I can expand.
Well, yeah, all the information you've given so far is super helpful. So Rob asks, can farmer matching funds be used for non-eligible elements like building upgrades, or do those need to be outside of the application entirely?
Outside of the application. So the entire budget of you propose the budget of the full amount. So if you're asking for $50,000, you're showing them the budget of the 100,000 with your in-kind and the grant funding, and all of those expenses have to be things that are eligible. Yeah, if whatever that is critical to the project happening, then in the feasibility section, you'd have to address how it is that you're going to have that ready by the time you get the grant funding.
Okay, great. Charles asks, what is the timeline of the USDA? When do they announce funding and when do they expect projects to be implemented? So they typically announce funding between the end of December and the end of February. So we expect that to happen between, really now and the end of February. I think they announced at the end of February last year. And then Ellen, I think you can answer this question. When do they expect projects to be implemented?
Yeah, so we, in the applications, you start the projects when you're expecting to see funding. So typically that's around October of the same year. And then once funding is actually announced, if that date needs to shift, say they don't actually get around to telling people until November, they'll give you the window to change. They'll tell you you're funded. They'll give you the window to change your start date so that it starts when the actual funding comes in. And then you have up to 3 years to do the project. In your application, you lay out a timeline. I always recommend to people to at least give yourself 2 years. There's no reason to undercut yourself. You can always end a project early, but you can't always extend one. So I'd say give yourself more time rather than less. And they want to see a first reimbursement request within 90 days of when you first get funding. So if you got funding by October 1st, they're going to want to see a first reimbursement request November, December, January 1st to know that the project's underway.
Okay, thanks, Ellen.
Mm-hmm.
Delia asks, They're wondering about the market differentiation category of project types. So if they want to sell the same product to different markets, for example, instead of seeds for eating, retailing the seeds for growing, would that be eligible under the market differentiation category?
Hmm.
And some of these questions, if we need to,
yeah.
table them and do more research, we can always come back to folks.
The market differentiation category is really about you differentiating yourself from other people in the market. So whether that's free range, grass fed, non-GMO, organic, like market differentiation means more that, because what we would have to like how you approach a market differentiation with all of the grants, you have to show that what you're doing is adding value to the commodity. So the way that we do that in a market differentiation is we show like, here's what tomatoes are selling for in our area. Here's what organic tomatoes are selling for. So organic is adding $1 a pound to tomatoes, and that's the value add. So I don't think that it's not like a use, like those seeds would have to be somehow have a market differentiation, where this is more just an intended use differentiation.
Well, I know I am having a hard time wrapping my mind around it, but there would be a difference in the income associated with selling seeds for retail as opposed to selling them. I mean, it's not only a difference in use, but it's a difference in the amount of income that would come from selling the seeds for retail use. I don't know if that makes a difference.
It's not that, but that you mean like because retail, you can sell them for higher than wholesale?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's not like a retail specific category, like because the channels are just kind of the way that you sell the product, which could be in any of those buckets for the value added producer grant.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just retail. Maybe I didn't say it right. It's like a different use, as you were saying. So selling them for eating, they cost less than if you sell them for a different use.
Okay.
Growing.
Yeah, I haven't come across this one before. Like I usually think of market differentiation as these different logos and things that you can put on your product and that we can then yeah. So I think that this one honestly would be a good question for a state rep of just explaining what it is and seeing if they would consider that in one of the categories, because it's not something I've come across before.
Great. Thank you, Ellen.
Yeah.
Delia, I see you have another question later on. Does that answer both of them or?
Well, I think the second one's kind of a moot point for me since I don't know whether
Okay.
the whole idea is viable, but it was confusing.
Yeah.
That there were no packaging and branding costs covered in the working capital grants when marketing differentiation relies on that.
So one thing I think that's great for you to bring up, because if that's how it sounded, it's not how I intended the meaning. So paying for the packaging is definitely included. So like printing the boxes and getting, from whatever their name is, I can't think of it right now, but they have those like organic pre-printed organic boxes for produce, or getting your own
Clamshells.
printed. Not necessarily clamshells or the big craft boxes. There's a company down in Central California that a lot of people use around here that I can't think of, but so like getting those kind of pre-printed boxes that say organic on the side, or having your own branded ones that you're printing, all of that would be doing marketing material that has the USDA logo on it that talks about the fact that you're organic, doing stickers on crops that are going to be sold, in grocery that have a thing about organic and have like a QR code that pops up to a website that talks about how you grow the products. All that stuff would be covered. It's just the actual just like design part of it is they don't want to see the word design in working capital applications. But the packaging, a lot of the packaging is always a big part of what people typically are in projects that I work with.
Thanks for clarifying that, Ellen.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, Ash has a question. Does the COGS part of the grant have to include how the personal cash match is spent, or is it solely for the amount that is requested?
Okay, I feel
So
like that's a good one for me to read. Okay, do the COGS part of the grant have to include how the personal cash match is spent? So the cost of goods part of the grant is completely separate from the budget. You talk about the cost of goods. If it's the cost of goods comes in when you're talking about feasibility and economics, the financial sustainability of the project, and also when you're talking about the added value, if you're talking about a change in physical state, processing the product. So that's where the cost of goods comes in. And then the budget will show the grant request, your personal cash match, and then your in-kind contribution and exactly what each one is going to be spent on.
And then Kelly just added one that I'm going to tack on to this one. Does the one-on-one match need to be, when does the one-on-one, the cash match need to be paid? Is it by the end of the project?
That is such a great question. So when we submit your application, we have to show that you have access to it. So the cash portion of it, you'd have to have in a bank account or in a loan, or we'd have to get documentation to show you have access to the cash amount of money. Then when you get funding and you start spending it, this is a reimbursement grant. So you spend the money on the thing. So you buy all the jars and then you get 50% of it, depending on how you, this is all depending on how you set up your budget, but this is how I set up the budgets, is you buy the jars, you have to have the cash to buy them, and then you get reimbursed for 50%. And that 50%, you have to stay at that one-on-one match throughout the grant period. So you can't, ask for all the money from them and then you put in the money all at the end. Throughout, you're doing one-on-one. But we can structure your budget in such a way that you're able, that thinks about your cash flow so that you can make sure that in real time, you're able to go on to the next phase of the project.
Great, thanks, Ellen. Tammy has a question. What if you have not had actual sales yet, but have done some feasibility and have the required cottage food license, etc.? Should you wait to apply until after some sales, or would a small simplified application be okay?
So there's not like a just one quick answer to this. I'll give you a few things that I think about. And now I blanked out. So it's good to have some sales. It's good to have, thank you, Grace. I know I just stopped, but it's good to have some sales because you're projecting sales, and you projecting sales based on some amount of sales gives the reviewers, it seems, more confidence in the fact that you will be able to pull off the project. I've had reviewers tell me, even if it's, 3 months of sales, we do want to see some amount. This is unofficial, but they say we do want to see some amount of sales. Now, I worked with someone last year that they had not sold the project in question much yet. They had done really small, they had brought together very loose groups of friends to do test batches with, and they had run those. So we had some narrative of explaining why we thought there was a market for the project. And then they had, very loosely having done some test batches and test selling it at the farmer's market. So really small amount of sales. We're talking about like, I don't even remember. It was like maybe 100 of them, but we were able to then use that. And the fact that they had these farmers market relationships for a long time, they had really strong customer base in farmers market. So they have a way to sell the product, that now they have a stand that once they introduce the product, there's going to be people that see it. So it kind of depends. If you have those things, then I think you can sometimes make a case for it. And the other thing, like last year, I worked with someone that they hadn't been selling. It was apple cider vinegar. So they hadn't been selling apple cider vinegar at their farm stand, but they had been selling someone else's. So now we had some sales amount that we could say, we've been selling this other apple cider vinegar, we want to sell our own. And we could also say, we sell olive oil already. It's a great companion product, and these are our olive oil sales. So we can make some assumptions about how many of those customers are going to buy the apple cider vinegar. So I don't want to give you like a flat out no, you definitely wouldn't be ready, because it depends on some of those other things. If you have a farm stand or a farmer's market that you have access to customers and we have sales that prove that part of it, then with a newer product, we might be able to make the case that that is strong enough to get a well scoring application. If you're not like dying for the money right now, then yeah, take a year, build some sales, make sure that it's a product that you really want to sell, because once you get this funding, it's for this specific project and you want it to work out well so that, you have a gold star with the USDA and can ask for more money in the future.
Thanks, Ellen.
Yeah.
We're getting toward the end and I want to get to Adam's question. So I'm kind of trying to go through the chat to see what I can answer myself.
Okay.
But this one is particularly relevant for you. Can you please explain the difference between the scholarship program and the mentorship program? Besides writing the grant, do you provide more support in guiding to develop the strategy behind bringing products to market?
Yeah, Adam. So there's like the one-on-one work that I do is what the scholarship program is helping offset the cost for. And then there's the mentorship. So the one-on-one is just that. It's I'm writing the grant for you, and that whole plan phase, I'm coming up with strategy for your specific farm. It is a little different than I think a lot of grant writers. They just are taking a project that's already totally formed and they're just putting it into the words of a grant, where that first phase for me and my clients really is us putting our heads together and figuring out, okay, what is a way forward that's going to grow this project that makes sense? What are the sales projections? What is, the items you're going to need in your budget in order to meet those goals? So that whole phase is me and Liz like specifically working with your farm. The mentorship is a group model. So the base level of the mentorship is through group calls. So it's for group calls where I lead you through how to write the grant yourself. There's Q&A, there's weekly Q&As that are outside of the group calls, and the group calls have a lot of Q&A. So people get their questions answered, but at the end of the day, it's you who's putting together your strategy and you who's writing the grant. And there is a new tier of the mentorship that I launched this year that also includes, I think it's 3 one-on-one calls with me, and those are an hour each. So that's one way to get some one-on-one time with me, but really the mentorship is more of a group thing. And we answer your questions through the Q&A and things like that, but we're not one-on-one working on your specific application with you.
And how much does it cost? What's the cost of that mentorship program, Ellen?
The base level is $900. And then the one, I don't remember because I just launched it. There's one that you get 3 one-on-one calls with me, and that's I forget exactly. It's on the website. It's like
It's on the
between
website.
1,500 and 2,000. I think it's like around $1,500, I think.
Okay, great.
Hmm.
Well, there are some lingering questions, and I think for the most part, they are coalescing around eligible versus ineligible expenses. So I think to close us out, is there a resource that you know of that clearly breaks down the eligible and ineligible expenses, or is that something that, you know, folks can look at the general categories that we've given today and ask more specific questions to their rural development offices? How do you advise
Yeah.
folks to go about getting that information?
There isn't, I haven't seen like one comprehensive list. So I feel like those categories, and when you send out the email, you send out a replay, right? Do you send the slides too? Or
I will.
okay, so going back to that slide and like thinking through those categories is a great place to start. And then, yeah, anything that's like you're really unsure of, a good person to talk to is the rural development. You're welcome to email projects@ellenrawley.com. I'll stick that in the chat. Our answer might end up being, we don't know, and talk to your USDA-RD rep, but if we do know, we're happy to answer the question. I noticed Terry's last question, and the wine bottles, corks, labels, and labor would all get covered by the grant. So like those kinds of things would go under packaging, and then staff are the buckets that those ones fall under.
Yeah, just to add to that, Ellen, once the actual RFP launches from USDA, there's usually a pretty detailed like table of like eligible and ineligible costs. So that might not give all the answers, but at least we'll have a little bit more clarity.
Yeah, and that's a great thing to just as like a reminder, is all of this is our best presentation so that we can open the scholarship application so people have time to fill them out this year, but it is based on 2020. It's based on the past, so there could be changes in the RFP to those eligibility things as well, which will definitely, you know, communicate as we go through the scholarship application process.
Yeah, thanks so much for that reminder and for going through all of those questions with such detail and care. It's been great to do another webinar with you, Ellen. As a reminder for folks, we will send a recording of this and a PDF of the presentation, hopefully tomorrow. I know for folks who are wanting to get their scholarship application in, time is of the essence. For folks who whose question we didn't get to, in addition to emailing Ellen, you're also welcome to email me. My email is grace@caff.org. with any questions. And yeah, I think we'll sign off now, let everyone enjoy their evenings, and you know how to get in touch with us. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank
And
you.
Terry,
Good night.
we'll send the resources that have been included in the chat.